Scott Weiland was not your typical rock frontman. Even in a decade defined by tormented voices and troubled brilliance, he stood out, blazing bright at the intersection of 90s, alternative rock and pure, unbridled chaos. He could transform a stage into a vortex of grunge-fueled electricity, but that same talent also turned inward, gnawing at him. By the time his tour bus door closed for the last time on a cold December night in 2015, he had become more than the Stone Temple Pilots guy, more than the Velvet Revolver voice, more than a once-celebrated icon. He was a man undone by the same forces that had once propelled him to stardom. His journey, from the haunted corners of his childhood to the final lonely moments in Bloomington, Minnesota, reveals a life that was shaped by heartbreak, fueled by addiction, and punctuated by fleeting moments of triumph that never managed to save him in the end. When Scott was just a boy of 12 years old, something happened that would cast a shadow over his entire future. At the time, he was living in Ohio. A typical day might have meant baseball practice or trading jokes with classmates, childish, innocent experiences. Then came the assault. A high school student, older and stronger, abused him. Scott described it decades later in his memoir, Not Dead and Not for Sale, 2011, calling it a quick violation that left him terrified and speechless. He carried that horror in silence. There was no one he felt he could tell. He was too afraid, too shocked, too ashamed. So he buried the memory until it leaked out in therapy many years down the line. A buried bomb that left emotional shrapnel in his psyche. That trauma, combined with who knows what else in his family environment, set certain wheels in motion, ones that would be impossible for him to stop once they gained momentum. Though it's risky to reduce a life to one childhood event, many close to him suspected that this traumatic episode at 12 served as ground zero for his lifelong struggles. If you draw a map from that assault, you can trace a line through the heartbreak, the self-medication, the sense of not belonging. Even as a teenager, his experimentation with substances took off, initially just dabbling with alcohol and cocaine, but it all escalated dangerously in 1993. That was the year Stone Temple Pilots exploded onto the scene. They'd released their debut album, Core, a year before, and it had soared to platinum status. Suddenly, the reluctant kid was a rock star. Instead of rapt fans in small clubs, he faced stadiums screaming his name. Instead of local bars, he had MTV rotations. And with that success came a swirl of temptation that proved too intoxicating to resist. Heroin became his new anchor, or, better said, his new prison. Around 1995, the trouble started stacking up. He got convicted of buying cocaine. The headline screamed that the Stone Temple Pilots frontman had been caught scoring drugs. He was given a year of probation. On tours, his bandmates watched as he drifted further into the haze. Weiland once likened heroin's hold on him to a black chemical that severed him from everything he loved, including the music itself. The rest of STP faced the fallout too. Missed gigs, abrupt cancellations, nights of meltdown. Over the years, Weiland tried multiple stints in rehab. Some fans cheered when they heard he was clean, only to see him spiral again, whether with booze, heroin, or prescription pills. One arrest in 2007 for driving under the influence, during a time he was visibly out of control, further hammered home the cyclical nature of his life. Attempts to climb out of addiction only to relapse. The band that had once soared together found itself weighed down by his chaos. He was fired from Velvet Revolver in 2008 and ultimately from STP again in 2013, each ejection accompanied by public feuds, humiliations, and the sense that his talent was overshadowed by his demons. Digging deeper into the timeline of 1995, one can see a pivotal moment. He nearly died from a heroin overdose in Los Angeles. STP were in the thick of releasing and touring for Purple, their second album, which had soared even higher than their debut. They had become superstars almost overnight, but that success masked a building catastrophe. Weiland's heroin habit was intensifying. That day, after a spree of partying, he overdosed. His bandmates found him unconscious. Paramedics rushed in, managed to revive him, and thus began Weiland's first forced rehab stint under court order, since he had also faced charges involving crack cocaine that same year. This nearly fatal brush became an omen, a sign that the unstoppable frontman was dancing too close to the abyss. The DeLeo brothers, Dean and Robert, struggled to trust him afterward. The synergy that had once fueled STP's rise started to crack, culminating in more tensions. Weiland would often speak of that 1995 experience as the start of his long dance with death, the point at which the door to oblivion opened, beckoning him inside. Yet the troubles extended well beyond drugs. There was heartbreak and grief swirling in the background, too. In 2007, his younger brother Michael died at 38 from cardiomyopathy, brought on by drug complications. The two had once bonded over music and, unfortunately, over addiction. The news rocked Scott, who was still grappling with his own issues, playing with Velvet Revolver and trying to keep afloat in a chaotic life. In his memoir, Weiland confessed a gnawing sense of guilt, as though he could have done more to help Michael, saved him from the path leading to that final moment. But he was in no position to save himself, let alone rescue anyone else. That same year, in 2007, a violent domestic altercation sealed the fate of his second marriage to Mary Forsberg. The couple had 2 children, Noah and Lucy, but that familial bond wasn't enough to stop the meltdown. The meltdown happened at the Hard Rock Hotel in L.A. A drunken fight led to property damage, calls to the police, mutual arrest for domestic violence, later dropped. The fiasco ended in a divorce the following year, with Mary retaining custody of their children. Weiland lamented that he felt like a failed father, an admission that, behind all the bravado, he was deeply tormented by losing day-to-day contact with his kids. The public humiliation only got worse. In April 2008, Velvet Revolver officially fired Weiland, citing his erratic behavior, potential heroin relapse, and general unreliability on tour. Duff McKagan, Matt Sorum, and Dave Kushner put out statements that he'd become too unpredictable. Weiland, never one to stay silent, fired back on stage with STP, lashing out at his ex-bandmates. But that public feud only heightened the sense of a man burning bridges left and right. He was mourning the death of his brother, wrestling with addiction, reeling from a divorce, and losing a major project in quick succession. The meltdown continued. Many in the rock world watched, hearts sinking as he retreated further into his own personal darkness. Some prayed he would find a lifeline in his next musical endeavor. Others cynically saw it as just another Weiland meltdown that they'd read about in tabloids before the next redemption arc arrived. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and not the mild kind. The severe swings between mania and depression made it nearly impossible to function in a stable way. The mania might bring creative bursts or unstoppable energy on stage, but the depressive lows coupled with addiction spelled disaster. At various points he tried medication, but side effects like suddenly gaining 18 kilograms would make him ditch the pills, or he'd find them ineffective in the long run. Searching for relief, he often turned to the substances he knew, intensifying that vicious cycle. By 2015, his health had deteriorated further. He faced complications like hepatitis C, likely from intravenous drug use, which sapped his energy and left him more prone to illness. On stage, fans noticed he wasn't the same dynamic presence. his voice sometimes a shadow of its former glory. Tragedy found him again that same year, 2015, in multiple forms. First, there was the death of Jeremy Brown, his friend and guitarist in the Wildabouts, who died from a multi-drug overdose and existing heart issues on March 30th, a day before their album Blaster was scheduled to launch. For Weiland, this was a blow to his attempt at a comeback. Blaster was meant to reintroduce him to the rock scene on his own terms, away from STP and VR controversies. Instead, Brown's sudden passing overshadowed the release, pulling Weiland deeper into despair. Then came more personal heartbreak. Scott was distanced from his children, Noah and Lucy, for reasons linked to his ongoing drug use, while simultaneously grappling with parental cancer diagnoses. His father had prostate cancer, and his mother, Sharon, had also received a cancer diagnosis. The man had lost a brother to heart trouble. He'd lost a dear friend in Jeremy Brown to an overdose. Now his parents were in cancer battles. The emotional toll was severe. During a show in San Diego in 2015, Nick Mayberry, another Wildabouts member, recalled Weiland breaking down in tears backstage. He was worried about his mom, lamenting the fact that he'd already lost so many people. For a man who once seemed unstoppable, with that fierce half-sneer on stage, those tears backstage revealed a battered soul losing its last reserves of hope. Meanwhile, finances were bleak. The once platinum-selling Rockstar was close to broke, behind on debts. He parted ways with Stone Temple Pilots yet again in 2013, severing a major revenue stream. He was stuck playing smaller venues with the Wildabouts, but ticket sales were dismal, and cancellations piled up. Critics observed that his performances often felt phoned in or disjointed, fueling rumors that he'd relapsed again. Some shows were borderline painful to watch. The spark that once electrified audiences in the 90s seemed extinguished, replaced by a weariness that was at once physical, mental, and emotional. He kept going, though, or tried to. On December 3rd, 2015, the Wildabouts were scheduled for a show in Bloomington, Minnesota, a typical mid-level gig on Weiland's final struggling tour. By the time the day arrived, the show had been canceled. Weiland's body was discovered that evening on his tour bus, unresponsive. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner concluded that he died from an overdose of cocaine, MDA, and alcohol, compounded by a history of heart disease, asthma, and multi-substance dependence. There was also mention of how his arteries were 90% blocked, suggesting advanced cardiovascular problems typically seen in much older individuals. While official statements called it an accidental overdose, Weiland's wife Jamie countered that labeling it a simple overdose was too reductive. She argued that his heart had given out, battered by years of drug use and unhealthy living. Indeed, the synergy of addiction, compromised health, and depression had reached the inevitable endpoint. In the immediate aftermath, the police discovered a small amount of cocaine in Weiland's bunk area. The band's bassist, Tommy Black, was briefly detained for possession. And just like that, headlines blared the all-too-familiar story of a once-famed musician found dead in a swirl of narcotics. For his fans, it was a final heartbreak. Many had rooted for Weiland to overcome his demons. The tributes poured in from industry peers who recognized not only his vocal gifts, but also the fragility that made him an archetype of the tortured rock star. Friends remembered him as gentle, creative, but forever wrestling with the ghosts from his past. Mary Forsberg, the mother of his 2 children, published an emotional open letter describing how his kids had effectively lost their father long before that day. She insisted that fans not glamorize his death, pointing out that addiction had robbed them of truly knowing him. Thinking about Weiland's final years, one can't ignore the swirl of near-constant tragedy. He lost his brother, his marriage, his band membership, close friends, and stable finances. He endured mental illness, physical illness, and the knowledge that his parents were battling cancer. The man was broken in more ways than one. Perhaps the biggest tragedy is that he did try, multiple times, in multiple ways, to break free from heroin's hold, only to slip back whenever life dealt him another blow. Even the hush of 2015 with that new album blaster and a fresh lineup didn't offer enough hope to keep him afloat. In those final months, he also mentioned Chris Goss, his former mentor from the days of STP's Tiny Music Sessions. Goss had played a huge role in shaping Weiland's confidence, encouraging his new vocal styles. But Goss's own health issues during the early 2010s weighed on Weiland's mind. He feared losing one more anchor. That fear contributed to the gloom that overshadowed him after Jeremy Brown died. Without those vital pillars of support, Weiland was left feeling adrift, precisely when he needed emotional stability. The precariousness of his mental health, combined with everything else, created a perfect storm. His final day came unceremoniously. No big meltdown in the press, no dramatic confrontation with bandmates. Just an abrupt silence. The lifeless body of a 48-year-old man on a tour bus that was meant to carry him to his next gig. A man who had sold over 50 million records worldwide, bridging the post-grunge era to modern rock, found alone in the end. The heartbreak for the rock community was instant, but perhaps not surprising. Fans, bandmates, ex-wives, children, so many had seen the warning signs. Yet how do you rescue someone from a downward spiral that's gone on for decades? After his death, the tributes poured in. Former bandmates posted heartfelt messages, acknowledging the complicated man behind the microphone. Fans lit up social media discussing how Plush or Creep or Fall to Pieces had shaped their teenage years. Mary Forsberg wrote candidly about the illusions that haunted him, the illusions that had once drawn them together, and the illusions that eventually killed him. She asked fans not to glorify his passing. Instead, she wanted them to see that behind the glamour of stardom was a father who left behind 2 children. They wouldn't have him for birthdays or graduations. That's the real face of tragedy, where the illusions crumble, and we see the raw aftermath for those left behind. Many say that rock and tragedy are forever intertwined. If that's true, then Scott Weiland's story is part of a lineage that includes Joplin, Morrison, Cobain, and others who burned bright and left scars on the collective musical psyche. But each life is individual, and Weiland's was complicated by the specific details of that childhood assault, the doping arrests, the near-fatal overdoses, the divorces, the meltdown with Velvet Revolver, the heartbreak of losing family, and eventually the final quiet aid. There's no single reason that explains it all, just a mosaic of circumstances that built up until it collapsed. Corey Taylor of Slipknot, who had performed with him, lamented how unstoppable he'd once seemed on stage. The DeLeo brothers from STP, with whom he'd shared so many ups and downs, posted a subdued statement of grief. Even his ex-bandmates in Velvet Revolver expressed sorrow, remembering the ephemeral magic they'd created in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, fans who'd followed him from Plush to Fall to Pieces felt that hollow sensation that accompanies losing a voice that had scored their personal histories. Time has not erased his legacy. In some ways, it's grown. The best measure of a musician's impact is how the songs endure. Stone Temple Pilots' hits remain classic rock radio staples, continuing to find new ears. Teenage novices discover them and feel that same raw energy from Weiland's howling vocals. They might learn about his chaotic life later, but for a moment they just connect with the passion in the music. Maybe that's the greatest gift Weiland left us, the raw sincerity of a performer who, for all his flaws, poured himself into the microphone. That sincerity can't be faked. Even with the cracks and the storms, or perhaps because of them, he delivered authenticity that fans embraced. So the next time you hear his raspy baritone cut through a riff, let it remind you that behind the songs was a man who never stopped wrestling with the ghosts unleashed in Ohio at age 12. Let it remind you of the meltdown in 1995, the near-fatal overdose that preluded a long waltz with mortality. Let it remind you of the meltdown in 2007, the public arrests, the band firings, the battered finances. Let it remind you that he tried again and again to stand back up only for more tragedy to strike, more heartbreak to weigh him down. Let it also remind you that even with everything stacked against him, he still found time to love, to create, and occasionally to triumph. That's the life of Scott Weiland. He soared as a vital voice of the 90s, redefined supergroup potential in the 2000s, and then burned out in a swirl of misfortune and heartbreak in 2015. A tortured soul who nonetheless had the capacity to command a stage, to lead a band, to belt out lyrics that stuck in your head long after the final chord. A father, a husband, a friend, but also a man so scarred that he couldn't break addiction's chains. If you measure him by the album sales and the chart hits, he was a success story. If you measure him by the downward spiral, he was a tragedy. And in the echo of his voice, we find both the pain and the unbreakable spark that made him who he was.